that you can check right there. There's a wall which features those rare stills from Indian cinema and some from abroad. That stills, that moments that have got big changes and connect to a lot of emotions. This year's theme being romance, love and violence. It's very appropriate to have Indian cinema and the stills up there on the wall. This year it will feature iconic and rare stills, as I said, and posters from cinema which resonate the theme. Ladies and gentlemen, let's begin our first session. Welcome back to the third day of the Times of India Literary Carnival 2013. We don't get these Sunday mornings. Normally it's supposed to be a little lazy, but this is one of the most active and the best Sunday mornings that we have. So good morning, everyone. Talking about the Times Literary Carnival, we've been talking about this from the last 2 days. We've carefully selected people who come up on stage and talk to everyone in the audiences. It may be publishers, lyricists, authors, directors, writers, and most of all the cerebral people that we categorically say are up here on the stage to talk to everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, this year's theme, as you all know, is romance, love and violence. And that is the only reason why the wall outside, which is one of the most prominent features of this Lit Fest from the last 3 years, this year the wall features those iconic stills from Bollywood and the Indian cinema. Those few scenes, those few captures that speak a lot are all there on the wall outside. You can check it over there. Yet again, welcome back. And talking about the Times of India, I am sure it's a part of literature and everyone comes from the Times of India. And this year, being very special, we celebrate the 175th Jubilee of the Times of India. Now, to begin with the first session for the day, we have the first session which is called Young Tagore. The man behind the icon, Sudhir Kakkar, is here with us, who reads from his psychobiography of India's most multifaceted geniuses. Sir, could you please come up on stage? Ladies and gentlemen, can we give a big round of applause for Mr. Sudhir Kakkar? And just to give a brief introduction about him, I am sure this one paragraph doesn't speak all about him, but I try to give the best introduction that I can. Mr. Sudhir Kakkar is a psychoanalyst and a novelist who lives in Goa. His many honors include the Gardner Award of Columbia University, the Boyer Prize for Psychological Anthropology of American Anthropological Association, Germany's Goethe Medal, Rockefeller Residency, MacArthur Fellowship, and the Order of Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany, the country's highest civilian honor. As a psychoanalyst of civilization, the French weekly La Nouvelle Observateur listed Kakkar as one of those 21 thinkers, while the leading German, Die Zeit, has profiled him as one of the 21 thinkers for the 21st century. So we're talking about that person who's just one out of those 21 best in the 21st century. So ladies and gentlemen, give a big round of applause for one and only Mr. Sudhir Kakkar. And now he reads from his book for all of us. A session for an hour begins now. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Yes, I think I can. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I am going to read from the psychobiography of Tagore. Now, what is a psychobiography first? A psychobiography is really an invitation to the biographer to mine the life of a person for emotional truths rather than facts, and thus lay bare the deeper motivations of a person's life. Not aiming for a comprehensive account of life from birth to death, what a psychological biography does is to be selective of the events on which it concentrates. Essentially, the psychological biographer believes that events which comprise his subject's formative experiences lie in the periods of his childhood and early youth, and that a person's psychological truth is preeminently an outcome of his or her early relationships. So this is the basis of the biography of Tagore. It requires three things which are essential for the psychological biographer. I will just list them without going deeply into them. One is empathy for the subject. Others is to look for repetitive themes in the life. Because what a psychological biographer believes, that your main scenes of the inner theater are formed very early in life, and the rest of the life we repeat them, but in forms which are good or suitable for that stage of life. I mean, a little baby loves differently than an adult man or an old man, and that these themes, so to have some kind of to spy out those themes of the life. I'll only talk about, say, empathy. So the empathy, of course, also calls for an introspective exploration of the biographer's own emotional stance towards the subject, both pre-existing and the changes it undergoes as he engages more deeply with the subject. So I will just give some of my own towards Tagore, because otherwise most biographers, normal historical biographies, ignore that. How much of their own parts or what they want, their idealizations or looking down on the subject goes into the biography. So growing up well into adulthood, I was never attracted to Tagore. Like any middle-class Indian boy, I was aware of his literary stature and had even read one of his stories, The Kabuliwala, in a school textbook, but had always felt vaguely repelled by his flamboyant appearance in photographs, where he always seemed to be clad in a loose robe that came down to the ankles, wore shoulder-length hair, and sported a flowing beard that framed a grave, unsmiling face. He reminded me of Bhagwan Rajneesh, or Osho as he was known later, though without the latter's endearing mischievousness. I had skimmed through Tagore's own translation of the poems of Gitanjali, his Nobel Prize-winning work, and with the callousness of youth, dismissed them as verses of stereotyped sentimentality and saccharine spirituality. Without giving it much thought, I was ready to give credence to the rumor that no one in the Nobel Committee for Literature had heard of him or read his work before W.B. Yeats recommended Gitanjali for the prize in 1913, and that, given the politics of the prize, it was time for an Asian laureate. I was thus in no danger of idealizing Tagore. The pitfall lay more in my minimizing of his stature, in his devaluation. My shallow stance towards Tagore, which I now recollect with some shame, was fueled by an early identification with my father's attitudes, which I won't go into that. But then 2 years ago, I was invited by the National Gallery of Modern Art in New Delhi to give a talk on Tagore's paintings as a part of his 150th birthday celebrations. I accepted, challenged as much by the opportunity to discover Tagore as by the novel task of engaging with the visual medium, rather than my normal province of language and words. The discovery was momentous. Tagore's spirituality, which I had once airily dismissed as naive nature mysticism, revealed itself as a profound feeling of kinship and empathetic connection with the earth and the plants, trees, birds, animals, and indeed all life forms that it sustains. The solemn, lushly bared visage of the rishi of my childhood mythology peering out from his photographs, which I had once instinctively distrusted, now revealed itself as a mask protecting the vulnerability of a highly sensitive man, a profound introvert who must have suffered in a world that often demanded he be an extrovert. There's nothing quite as stressful as an introvert forced to be an extrovert. I know it from my own experience. A liking of the subject, the prerequisite for empathy, as long as it limits itself to admiration, is a must for an intending biographer of inner life. This is where the psychological biographer essentially differs from his historical counterpart, for whom liking and dislike of the subject are largely irrelevant. Indeed, there are many instances of great historians who have been at daggers drawn with their subjects, a stance that is impossible for a psychological biographer. The pitfalls awaiting the psychobiographer are of a different order. The danger I faced as I immersed myself in Rabindranath's life and writings was of my mounting admiration, ascending into an idealization that is feature of the much of scholarship on Tagore, especially among some Bengali scholars who are so possessive of him that they dismiss any attempts by an outsider to fathom the mystery of his genius. Given his polymathic and philosophical breadth, his torrential output that reminds one of Rilke's words about Rodin, I quote him, "It's like holding a cup beneath a waterfall." I had to be careful that the pendulum did not swing the other way, from an initial and mild distaste to an outright idealization that can make one tentative and shy away from pursuing insights that reveal the face under the public mask. I start the first chapter with the first relationship with the mother, and then go on to, I think, what was the most traumatic part of childhood growing up. He was banished into the servants' quarter. This is what was normal at the age of 5, and grew up under the rules of servants. He called it growing up under servocracy. He was very lone, and I think suffered greatly. Tagore is one of the interesting persons who wrote 2 autobiographies, one at the age of 50 and one at the age of 70. And at the age of 50, it's a different kind of autobiography, which it should be, as at the age of 70, where he is much more. But in both of them, these years, from 5 to 10, are the most terrible years for him. I'm not going to go into those 2 chapters because, of course, I want some of you to buy the book also, otherwise, if I tell you, give you everything there. But he was extremely lonely. And this is, of course, the mystery, that he changed that loneliness often enough into solitude through the gift of poetry. He started writing at the age of poetry at 8. And somebody has asked me to talk about, you did, okay, on loneliness and in Tagore and solitude. Okay, then I'll read that out. Rabindranath, like no other writer, has explored the tension between loneliness and solitude in his own life. The one with a feeling of emptiness and being deserted, vulnerable to depression. The other, which is solitude, with a feeling of fullness and constant presence of loved others, even if they are long gone or physically absent. In life, as distinct from thought, the distinctions between being lonely and being solitary are not as clear-cut. There is an inevitable messiness where the two intersect and where the one changes into the other. Rabindranath was quite clear about solitude lying at the foundation of his psyche and his work. In a letter to C.F. Andrews, one of the very few people with whom Rabindranath sought some degree of intimacy in late adulthood, unlike most people, he had no friends from his youth. He writes, and I quote him, "During the most part of my life, my mind has been made accustomed to travel the inner path of dreams till it has lost all confidence in its power to thread its way through the zigzags of the outer world. In fact, its attention has never been trained to accept the miscellaneous responsibilities of the glamorous surface of life of society." Like the poet Rilke, who welcomed solitude where he could be in his work, quote, like a pit in its fruit, Rabindranath writes in another letter, "All through my life, I have ever worked alone, for my life and work have ever been one. I am like the tree which builds up its timber by its own inner living process. And therefore it needs leisure and space, sunlight and air. He was also cognizant of the distinction between alone and being solitary, and that the latter needed a harmonious presence of the mental representations of lost loved one in his psyche. Whenever Rabindranath felt lonely, his life burdened with responsibilities too heavy for a single man to bear, that is his quote, and again quote, stranded in a desolation where every individual has to struggle through his own problems unaided, it was his inner solitude that came to his rescue, and he, and I quote, felt against the current turn inward from the world to my soul. It is the flood tide of life and companionship. It sweeps my burdens off my shoulders and carries me along with it in its joyous course. Solitude was not only creative, but also curative, the one merging into the other. Yet even for the most self-sufficient solitary person, some direct connection with other human beings is a necessity. This is especially true for those whose work is centered around people and not phenomena of nature or abstractions of thought. The fences Rabindranath put around himself as an adult continue the theme of the confining chalk circle drawn around him as a child. The servants, because they didn't want to deal too much with him, that he's going out, drew a chalk circle and said, never get out of this, while they went and did their own thing, and he was in that small room with that chalk circle drawn around him. The difference is that what was then passively endured is now actively chosen as an adult. Rabindranath would be the master of his isolation. Yet the occasional and inevitable shortcomings in reaching this goal would renew an old suffering and victimhood. Here I must add that the creative solitude Rabindranath's soul is fretting for, where one withdraws from the world with imagination as one's sole companion, is hazardous if such a withdrawal is not an act of choice but imposed, in the sense that it is a consequence of intercourse with the world that one has found too painful. The danger then is not finding the healing balm of solitude, but the cold desert of loneliness, which many creative individuals seek to make bearable by narcissistic self-aggrandizement and a sense of grandiosity that spurns all human contact. Much like the patient who, when asked why he stays closeted in his room, compulsively masturbating, replies, "But doctor, that is where one meets the best people." Rabindranath's own view of his loneliness is characterized not by self-aggrandizement, but most of the time by self-abnegation. His inability to form attachments, a flaw in his character that sets him apart, but not above other human beings. He wrote in 1894 to his niece Indra Devi, and I quote him, "I feel ashamed to admit and sad to think that usually I feel very distressed with human company. I feel pain inside. Every day I advise myself to be like others, mix with people with ease, to enjoy life's pleasures with ease like others. But all along I've always had such a strange boundary